First up, we're going to make a point with an expansion on the foundational verse that the Lord used to communicate the Keystone pattern to me back in the spring of 2008. Then we're going to begin the flyover. John 13:38, Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times." The question posed to Peter was relevant, certainly back when Jesus addressed him, and just as certainly now, because the church is modeled for our instruction by Peter as a prophetic type. For an individual to be brought to that place where such a sacrifice can be made is a special privilege, because what's offered for sacrifice must be worthy. At this point, you should already understand that on a very personal level. Now, let the prophetic context inform you that the season being described is for the preparation of a people who will become, as their Lord himself was, a worthy sacrifice. The count of 3 occasions of denial identifies the number of Shemitah counted off from the celestial sign of 1991. Fully 3 must pass, and this is the basis for the Keystone pattern. When Jesus begins his declaration with the expression, "Truly, truly," he wasn't stammering. He wasn't filling up space with superfluous words that can be dismissed without losing something of the intended communication. His repetition is deliberate. There's intent and purpose. Look at this graphic, because this prophecy involves a repetition. We find many other notable examples of this prophecy that bear a similar testimony. With the offering of this expansion on John 13:38, we're trying to convey how it is that with each instance of the pattern discovered in the Holy Scriptures and in the biblical timeline, the contextual detail informs us further about the meaning. The many examples are not provided just to make the pattern itself more compelling. While it does that, the greater effect is to shine a brighter light on all that ultimately prepares that sacrifice modeled by Peter to become worthy. In addition to John 13:38, 3 other examples have been offered in this series. First, there was the extended Keystone appearing in the Messianic timeline as the Messiah appeared after the first 3 millennium had passed. Then Luke 20's parable of the vineyard, where 3 slaves were sent to collect the produce, and then the owner's son also. Then finally, Luke 13's parable, where fruit was sought from a fig tree in the vineyard for 3 years, with none being found. An agreement was made to defer judgment of the tree as unfruitful until after a season of dunging around the tree. Our 5th example now comes from another parable about bearing fruit. The sower went out to sow seed, and the seed falls in 4 different categories of soil. The first 3 listed produce no crop, which falls beside the road, on rocky soil, and among the thorns. The 4th category listed is called good soil, and a greatly multiplied crop results. About this parable, it's written in Mark 4:13, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable?'" This parable is about the seeing eye and the hearing ear that is required for the understanding of the word, which is esoteric. The structure of this foundational parable informs us about the Keystone pattern and its fundamental meaning, that this is about fruitfulness and the bringing forth of a multiplied crop, a crop that depends upon the understanding of the esoteric. The next example is from Proverbs 30, where we find an extended Keystone pattern that's actually composed of Keystone signaling sets. Here's the signal line from the first set from verse 15. "There are 3 things that will not be satisfied, 4 that will not say enough." Proverbs 30 is added depth because there are repeated 7-fold palindromic Hebrew words in the opening line, and this can be translated as "God has arrived." The 7-fold nature resonates with the Shemitah, and the repeating palindrome resonates with the reset of time that causes the Shemitah to repeat. We'll count Proverbs 30 as the 6th example in our flyover. Our next examples derive from what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. Our first example about Peter's 3 denials appeared in this context, John 13:38. When Jesus went off to pray, he prayed alone, but he told Peter, James, and John to remain in their place and keep watch with him. Jesus went off to pray, and after a season of intense prayer, he returned to find them sleeping. That happened 3 times. Matthew 26:44, and he left them again and went away and prayed a 3rd time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners." 2 examples of the Keystone pattern are woven together. The 3 disciples could not stay awake and pray, but Jesus could. See it? In the same scenario, we note that Jesus departed, prayed, and returned to awaken them 3 times. Then he left them behind as he was arrested and went off with the crowd. At the scene of the arrest, we find something that speaks very loudly to us about the repetition of a span that results from the reset of time. John 18:4. So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said to them, "I am he." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. So when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Therefore he again asked them, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way." Jesus asked in verse 7 what he had already asked in verse 4, "Whom do you seek?" But instead of responding with something like, "Huh? Deja vu, didn't you just ask us that?" they answer, "Jesus the Nazarene," like before. What do we make of that? Nothing? In the esoteric context, it definitely means something. When Jesus' adversaries draw back and fall to the ground, this prophesies about the resetting of time. With all that, we'll conservatively add 2 more examples to the total, Numbers 7 and 8. After Jesus was arrested, he was tortured severely and then presented before Pilate in a sham of a public trial. In Luke 23, we find that the crowd makes their demands for the release of Barabbas and for the other Jesus to be crucified, but Pilate denies them 3 times. After that, Pilate makes his final appeal, setting Barabbas free and releasing Jesus for crucifixion. Trial over. This brings our running total to 9. After being crucified, Jesus was buried. Exactly 3 full days later, that season was completed. Then he arose, and this brings our total to 10. If we take a step back, zooming out from this set to consider the context of the Messiah's ministry, another example comes into view, our 11th in the count, and this example reveals a fractal of the Keystone design. Luke 3:23 informs us about an important time element. When he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, being, as it was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. 30 is a nice round number that marks the completion of 3 decades. According to this accounting, it may be noted that those 3 decades passed with no fruit being produced because his ministry had not yet officially begun. But when it did, he ministered and bore the fruit that was appointed for his messianic identity and anointing. Beginning in that same verse, we find the account of a genealogy that continues through to the end of the chapter. This lineage extends all the way back through Adam to God himself, tracing back through the millennia of the timeline that exhibited the Keystone pattern of our earlier examples. 3 millennia passed without the arrival of the Messiah. Then he arrived, being conceived in the 4th and born as the 4th transitioned into the 5th. His ministry began in the 5th millennium in the count from God's bringing forth of Adam, beautifully modeling the extended Keystone pattern. Here's a fractal because nested within that season of his arrival is another of the same pattern evident in the first 3 decades of his life passing, before he begins an incredibly fruitful ministry. For our 12th example, we turn to the 29th chapter of Genesis and the account of when the patriarch Jacob meets his beloved Rachel. He arrives in his journey at a well with 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. While he talks with the shepherds, another flock arrives, herded by Rachel. Keystone, the symbolism of time, is magnified here because this is all about the well and drawing water from it, and the metaphor of water is time, of course. And with Jacob's rolling away of the stone from the mouth of the well, it speaks to us of a time mission. Another element of this account is possibly even more compelling. It has to do with the labor contracts between Jacob and Laban, Rachel's father. Jacob agrees to work for 7 years to secure Rachel for a wife, but Laban deceives him, with the result that Jacob contracts another 7 years to finally secure the bride he wants. We understand this as a prophecy about one of the exciting reasons why the 4th Shemitah will repeat in the 5th, to secure for Yeshua the bride he wants and deserves. Another biblical account that bears such a remarkable testimony about the repeating Shemitah begins in Genesis 41. The Pharaoh of Egypt has 2 dreams, the second being a variant of the first. Jacob's son Joseph is brought out of Pharaoh's prison to interpret the dreams. The dream is about 7 years of abundance that are followed by 7 years of famine. The 7 years of famine are so bad that they're represented as utterly consuming the 7 years of abundance. This prophecy informs us about how this present Shemitah is a season of great abundance that's necessary to survive the next Shemitah, which will utterly consume it. This is why we illustrate it in this graphic with Shemitah 860 in shadow and a line behind the consuming Shemitah 861. Amos 8:11, Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of the Lord. This informs us of the nature of the coming famine and of the abundance of this season of preparation. As we give more attention to what happened during the famine and focus on the key transitional scenario, another keystone pattern emerges. Joseph's mission was not just to save that region of the world in general, but to save Israel in particular. This involved relocating his father Israel and all his family and property from their home in the land of Canaan to Goshen in Egypt. There was another key dynamic involved in that, the bringing together of Jacob's family as a complete unit for the first time ever, because Joseph appears to have been betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery at about the same time Rachel died giving birth to his brother Benjamin. The way Joseph orchestrated the uniting of the family was very dramatic. When the trips that Joseph's brothers made to buy grain in Egypt are considered, they seem to number 2.5, but the esoteric layer suggests that it took 3 trips to complete the unproductive phase. Then the productive phase began, and there's the keystone pattern. A very dramatic turning back was involved that bears witness to the turning back of time that the repeating Shemitah pivot on. With this rich collection of elements pertaining to Joseph and his salvation mission, we'll raise the tally of examples in our count to 13. Important information about time is conveyed in Genesis 41:46. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. It may be seen that Joseph begins his ministry at the same age Jesus does. As noted earlier with our 11th example, the keystone pattern is evident in the appearance of a fruit-bearing season following after the first 3 full decades where no fruit was produced. We note that the 7 years of abundance began when Joseph was 30 and ended when he was 37, which is during his 4th decade. The 7 years of famine ended in his 5th decade when he was 44. This example is now the 14th in our tally, and this one reveals another fractal of the Keystone design, with the other time reset patterns exhibited during Joseph's ministry nested within the fruitful season of his life. When we consider the length of the season involved with Israel's residency in Egypt, we discover harmony with the extended Keystone pattern. With a span of 400 years, or 430 by another reckoning, it may be seen that 3 centuries passed during the period of their residency, even 4, but in the 5th they were delivered from the land of bondage. Reflecting on this observation, we compare 2 examples that were addressed earlier. In our second example, the Messiah was brought forth on the timeline of biblical history at the very end of 4 millennia, being born at the transition into the 5th. It was early in the 5th millennium that his ministry would begin, even as a deliverer, after the fashion of Moses. As seen earlier in our 6th example, Proverbs 30 provided several concise but cryptic declarations of the design. Verse 15b, "There are 3 things that will not be satisfied, 4 that will not say enough." 4 that will not say enough. So, to finally say enough, will it require 5? In Proverbs 30, there are 5 of these cryptic sets of lines, suggesting the number that will finally be enough. This echoes the testimony of many similar witnesses, and this is our hopeful expectation as we're about to cross over into the final year of this 4th Shemitah. So, with the familiar pattern being witnessed in the centuries of Israel's residency in Egypt, we raise the tally to 16 examples. When Moses led Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus, he was 80 years old. He himself had fled from Egypt 40 years earlier. His life divides neatly into 3 periods of 40 years each, because after the Exodus he led Israel until his death at the age of 120. That full span of his life is significant as the time number 12 multiplied. When we consider the leading of Israel out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, and the 3-fold life of Moses, who died just before Israel crossed over, we discover another Keystone design. 3 equal periods passed in the life of Moses, during which Israel was being prepared to enter the Promised Land. Moses died, and subsequent to that, Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land to take possession of it. Keystone. And with this, we raise the tally to 17. Within that context, a Keystone fractal is evident because more examples of the Keystone design appear as Joshua leads Israel up to and across the Jordan River. In Joshua 3, verse 2 reads, "At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the midst of the camp. They addressed Israel, giving commands about the crossing of the Jordan." Verse 5 reads, "Then Joshua said to the people, 'Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you.'" That was the day they crossed the Jordan River on dry ground while it was at flood stage. So, 3 days are called to our attention in advance of the crossing, when the people are prepared to cross over. The next day they cross over into the Promised Land, and that's the first step in their beginning to take possession of it. We'll count that as the 18th example in our tally. While Israel crosses the Jordan, 2 sets of 12 stones are being moved around the feet of the priests who stand in the dry riverbed holding the Ark of the Covenant. 1 set is taken out of the riverbed and 1 set's put in. We find our 19th example in the peculiar way the account is recorded in the Holy Scriptures. A close study of the thematic structure of the text where the stone-moving rituals are written reveals a familiar pattern. Line 1, "Take up for yourselves 12 stones." Line 2, "And carry them over with you." Line 3, "And they carried them over with them." Line 4, "Then Joshua set up 12 stones." The stones Joshua set up in the riverbed are given very little ink in the text, but there is a notable emphasis on the esoteric level. 3 lines tell the 12 stones taken out, which are identified with a memorial, a remembrance of events past. Keystone, the 4th line in the set, tells of the 12 stones put in. These stones speak to us in contrast to the memorial stones, as a looking forward in time to when the long work of preparation will bear fruit, when there will come an entrance into the promised land that's referred to in the 4th chapter of Hebrews. We've written and said much about how the crossing of the Jordan and the stone rituals prophesy about the resetting of time. Lord willing, we'll have much more to say about all that. For the next examples, we're going to shift our attention to the New Testament. The 21st chapter of the Gospel of John has been a favorite of mine for many years. The esoteric resurrection scenario always excites me, with the expressions of the special relationship between the bride and the 144,000 sons of Israel in the most amazing dramatization of Romans 11:15. I love it. Okay, let's see what John 21 has to reveal. In the 3 verses 15, 16, and 17, we find a kind of love test being administered in 3 parts, each with a question, response, and command. Then in verse 18, Jesus prophesies to Peter something that has to be seen as being directly related to the round of questioning. Verse 19 identifies this love test very distinctly with martyrdom. If you recognize the Keystone pattern and understand the prophetic import of this chapter, you know Peter is a type of the church, and that this season is for the administration of a series of love tests through which the church is being prepared as sheep being fed by a shepherd. The Lord will have a flock that is no longer immature and self-directed and girding themselves. I would touch lightly on this and move right on to the next example, but I can't do that. The Lord has something better in mind for us. He's emphasizing to me how this is paralleled our first example from John 13. I'm going to offer some commentary, but I must urge you to open your own Bible and compare these passages for yourself, seeking the Lord to impress upon you His own heart and mind. John 13:34 through 38. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, Where I go you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. You should see John 21 verses 15 through 19 as a parallel to that, with many elements in common. John 13 led directly to Gethsemane. Think about it. Do you understand how the appearance of the Keystone pattern identifies the prophetic context as the season of the Shemitah, counted off from the celestial sign of 1991? Do you comprehend the nature of a sacrifice, that it must be worthy, and that there is a ceremonial preparation involved in advance of the offering? Yes, this is sobering, as it must be. Philippians 4, verses 4 through 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I'm going to repeat something I said in the previous video. The many examples are not provided just to make the pattern itself more compelling. While it does that, the greater effect is to shine a brighter light on all that ultimately prepares that sacrifice modeled by Peter to become worthy. If you're not familiar with our study titled The Testimony of Gethsemane, Part 3, your final exam, we recommend giving it your full attention. Verse 18 of John 21 has a doubled expression, truly, truly, like in John 13:38, and this speaks to us of the doubled Shemitah in the polar division of the season. We can identify the season of Peter's youthfulness with the first 3 and even 4 in the count from 1991. When is that season of Peter's maturity, where he stretches out his hands and someone else girds him and brings him to where he doesn't wish to go? As the pattern in the context reveals, it's now very near. Verse 20 and following are a dramatic pre-enactment of the season when Peter, as the bride, follows her bridegroom on his way and sees the 144,000 sons of Israel following them both. After time has been reset, this prophecy will become a present reality. We're going to count the example of the love, test, prep, and sacrifice in John 21 as number 20 in the tally. But we're not done here. There's a larger scale keystone present in this chapter. It features an encounter with the Lord in his resurrection body. This amazing prophetic scenario is bracketed to give it emphasis, and the brackets themselves reveal the presence of a keystone design. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. After that announcement in the narrative, we find the remarkable prophetic allegory. Then, in the closing narrative, this instance of manifesting is identified with a count. Verse 14, this is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Why is the numbering of this particular appearance being called to our attention? For no reason whatsoever? The count is obviously important enough to mention in a chapter that closes with the following declaration. Verse 25, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. We should take away from this that the detail of being the third appearance in sequence is somehow important enough to warrant its inclusion when so much else has been excluded from the record. If you see a trend in this explicit mention of the third in a sequence, and by now you should, you're alerted to a potential keystone pattern in the context. And this is what we find. What follows that is a revelation about a particular fruit-bearing season that illustrates the reality of our time in the sequence of Shemitah counted off from the celestial sign of 1991. What begins in the verse that follows the mention of the third time is a marking of a transition with the statement that they have finished eating a meal, their breakfast. They are ready, as it were, for the workday to begin in earnest. With this addition to the collection, we'll raise our tally to 21. We note that the fruit-bearing season in this 21st example involves the 20th in our tally, which is that threefold love test and the resultant worthy sacrifice. Once more, there's a nesting of keystones and the distinctive fractal design that gives added emphasis to this esoteric level. Now, continuing on the theme of the sequence of appearances that Jesus made in his glorified body, we find another doubled keystone fractal in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that 1. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that 2. He was buried, and that 3. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Here's 3 things, and what's next depends on those 3 things having happened, because it's a witness to what they accomplished. They were preparatory. Then, as enabled by those 3 things that passed, he manifests himself in his glorified body, appearing as an exhibit and witness to all those on the list. With this example, we raise our tally to 22. In the fruitful season of that keystone, we find another keystone. To establish the count of items involved, we have to do some research because the first appearance isn't even listed. We just learned that the third appearance was the subject of John 21. In 1 Corinthians 15, this is mentioned in verse 5 as the appearance to the 12. It's the second in this list, so one is missing. According to the record of John chapter 20, Jesus had appeared first to Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb, where she initially thought he was the gardener. If we include that conspicuous omission in the count, what emerges is another keystone pattern. Jesus appeared to Mary, that's 1. To Cephas, that's 2. Then to the 12, that's 3. In this complete listing, the first is omitted, and no commentary is offered about the next 2 in the series. If we take this as a suggestion that we should consider the amount of attention being given to the items in this list, we find in the fourth listed appearance a far larger number of witnesses and the addition of a descriptive narrative, even one with a polar division of the kind found in so many similar examples. Yep, here's a keystone. 1 Corinthians 15:6. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. This descriptive narrative connects back to the outer keystone it's nested within on the point of how fallen asleep means that they died, as Christ himself died, as we read in verse 3. Another feature of interest involves the number of witnesses, more than 500 at one time. It could have been any number the Lord wanted, of course, but nothing is random in the Bible. Some truth is being conveyed for those with eyes that see and ears that hear. The number 500 is 5 multiplied. This mass appearance is the fourth in the actual sequence of appearances, and the multiplied 5 stamps it with that number. Look at this familiar graphic where we have the fifth, Shemitah, as a new fourth, and the one in which Jesus will literally appear to a great multitude. Every eye will see him. It seems fitting that the completed listing features 7 appearances, the number of a Shemitah. Also relevant is the observation that the minimization effect of the conspicuous omission of the first item in the complete list is repeated in the 7th, where the narrative emphasizes Paul's consideration of himself as the least of the apostles. The expression he uses to describe the Lord's appearance to him resonates with the resetting of time. Jesus appeared to Paul as one untimely born, as the NASB version renders it. The King James Bible, as of one born out of due time. The Aramaic Bible in plain English, as if to an aborted baby. The Darby Bible translation, as to an abortion. Bible commentaries offer a variety of explanations, but with an awareness of the esoteric context of the keystone pattern, this speaks to us of the peculiar reality of the truncation of this timeline as the reset returns us back into the past. We'll account this peculiar listing of appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 as the 23rd in our tally. Our next examples are from the 10th chapter of Acts. Peter is in prayer on a rooftop in Joppa when he receives a vision that involves a large sheet that's filled with unclean animals being lowered down from heaven and raised back up again. Acts 10:16. This happens 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. The vision in 3 cycles prepared Peter for what happened next, which began a very fruitful season as Peter was engaged to introduce salvation to the Gentiles. This brings our tally to 24, but there's more here. Acts 10, verses 19 and 20. While Peter was reflecting on the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you, but get up, go downstairs, and accompany them without misgivings, for I have sent them myself." After the 3 repetitions of the sheet being let down and taken up in the vision, Peter is informed about the men who have come looking for him, who are 3 in number, and not for no reason. This represents a nesting of a keystone inside keystone, the fractal relationship that should be getting familiar as a form that gives the esoteric context much more substance. This threefold vision and the arrival of the 3 men marks the end of this season of Peter's preparation, a season that is given further emphasis in the commands he receives. During the vision, in verse 13, he's told to 1. Get up, 2. Kill, and 3. Eat. In verse 20, the Holy Spirit tells Peter, 1. Get up, 2. Go downstairs, and 3. Go with them without hesitation. With redundant triples, the season of preparation for the fruit-bearing season is certainly complete. The next day, Peter leaves with the men, accompanied by some of the brothers from Joppa. Those who await their arrival in Caesarea at the house of Cornelius are not disappointed. The Roman officer Cornelius has also been prepared in advance of their appointed meeting, and the timing of his notification is telling. Acts 10:30, Cornelius said, 4 days ago to this hour I was praying in my house during the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in shining garments. 4 days ago to this hour, exactly 4 days earlier. Why? For no reason, not on the esoteric level. This identifies the meeting with Peter as happening at the point of transition between the 4th and 5th units in the count, which should by now be a familiar pattern. With our counting of the 3 cycles of the sheet vision as the basis of the 24th in our tally, we'll account the nested keystone scenario of the arrival of the 3 men sent by Cornelius as the basis for the 25th. Our next example comes a couple chapters later, in Acts 12. In this prophetic scenario, Peter has been imprisoned by Herod in Jerusalem, but the church is praying for him. An angel shows up in Peter's cell. Following the angel's direction, Peter is miraculously freed and let out of prison. The design of the prison provides the basis for the keystone pattern. Acts 12 verse 10, when they had passed the 1st and 2nd guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. In making their way out of prison, they passed the 1st and 2nd guard and then passed through the iron gate, a 3rd barrier in series, and Peter is free. Keystone. This is now the 26th example in our tally. We have long recognized this chapter as a prophetic dramatization of the bride theft and what happens subsequent to it. Now, recognizing how the keystone pattern is woven into the same scenario, this has more to reveal. Acts 12:11 through 17, when Peter came to himself, he said, now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. They said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brethren." Then he left and went to another place. After leaving prison, Peter comes to yet another outer gate, but this one he doesn't pass through. The door to the gate is open so those inside can see him, and Peter makes his request for them to bear witness, but he doesn't go through the gate. What happens while Peter's at the gate seems to defy all logic, unless you happen to recognize the esoteric prophecy. This 4th gate in sequence testifies of this 4th Shemitah. That Peter doesn't go through it reveals that this Shemitah is not like those before it, that there is something more to be accomplished before his journey's end. Peter leaves and goes to another place, and we might ask, where and why? But another relevant question is surely when, because this is about times and seasons. This is actually the topical thread used to lead me to discover this prophetic allegory many years ago, when the timing of the bride theft was being revealed with respect to the years of the target Shemitah itself. For the keystone pattern to be woven into this special passage is remarkable. Peter's leaving the 4th gate without having passed through illustrates how Peter as a church does not reach the end of his journey in this 4th Shemitah. His release from that prison of the first 3 was necessary, and the 4th also. But something remains to be accomplished, about which this account does not appear to reveal. Peter's passing through the 3 prison barriers is the basis for a keystone that is the 26th example in our collection. Of all those we've offered so far in this series, some may seem more or less compelling than others, but let the consistency and redundancy speak to you as you get your mind wrapped around the scope of the presentation. Can you dismiss this persistent set of patterns as a fabrication of our own invention? Is it plausible to dismiss these observations as meaningless or as riddles without solutions? We have not come to these as a collection of riddles that needed solving. We have been led to them because the solution was simply given by revelation, and these appeared in that light as it shined upon the esoteric scriptures. According to the 3rd chapter of 1 Samuel, the Lord called Samuel when he was a boy, while he was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Samuel heard his name being called and thought it was Eli, the high priest, who'd called him. This happened 3 times. Then Samuel heard his name being called again, and he finally recognizes it as the Lord in response to the call. This brings our tally of examples to 27. And while there's more here that's noteworthy, we're going to move on because this presentation is more about conveying a sense of the scope. In the 18th chapter of 1 Kings, we find a dramatic contest taking place on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of the false gods. This was about whose God was going to prove himself to Israel by answering with fire, consuming a sacrifice. After the 450 prophets of Baal failed, Elijah had the Lord's altar and sacrifice prepared. He commanded the sacrifice and the wood to be doused with water 3 times. After all that, the time had come. He prayed, calling for the Lord's answer, and the fire of the Lord fell, answering in a convincing fashion. With the series of water, 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 prayer at the appointed time, and the fire that manifested as the key to the successful outcome, this account in 1 Kings 18 provides another clear example, and the 28th in our growing collection. With the stones of the altar and the pitchers full of water used for the dowsing both being 12 in number, the time number, there's obviously more here, but let's move on. 3 very notable examples appear in the next chapter of the same book, 1 Kings 19. The larger scale of them appears in Elijah's journey as he flees from Jezebel's assassination squads. There are 3 distinct legs of the journey that brings Elijah to Mount Horeb, where he encounters God and receives a commission, which he then goes off to fulfill. Leg 1, Elijah flees to Beersheba with his servant and leaves his servant behind. Leg 2, Elijah goes a day's journey from Beersheba into the wilderness to sit down under a broom tree. Leg 3, after being refreshed by a ministering angel, Elijah travels for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. On his arrival at Horeb, Elijah experiences a final season of preparation, is commissioned, and leaves Horeb to fulfill it. We'll count this keystone of the journey as the 29th in our tally. As mentioned earlier, there are 3 examples in the account. The other 2 are nested inside the keystone of the journey as a fractal in a beautiful structuring of the narrative that's more rich than we can even begin to describe in this flyover. On his arrival at Horeb, Elijah lodged in a cave. The word of the Lord commanded him to go out and stand on the mount before the Lord, and the Lord passed by in a series that manifests the keystone design. Verses 11 through 13 tell of 3 things in sequence that God is not in: the strong wind, the earthquake, and the fire. Then comes the sound of a low whisper, and Elijah wraps his face in his cloak or mantle and goes out and stands at the entrance of the cave, where a voice comes to him, the Lord's voice. God was not in the first 3 things in series, but after, and with this we raise the tally to 30. At that point in the narrative, Elijah begins to receive his commission. Verse 15, and the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. Elijah has to return on the way he'd already been, which bears witness to the action of the resetting of time back into the past, so that the commission this esoteric passage actually prophesies about can be fulfilled. There is more support for this interpretation in the context, but let's consider the final example of the keystone formula in this passage. Verse 15 continues, and when you arrive you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, And Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. When Elijah arrives, his orders involve three things of a kind, three occasions of anointing. Typical of the Keystone formula, the three of a kind provides the foundation for what happens next. Verse 17, and the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. The three anointed men worked to that end as members of a team. The matter of the slaughter of the enemies of God was part of the Keystone account of the previous chapter, how Elijah had the prophets of the false gods slaughtered at the conclusion of the contest on Mount Carmel. But the message is that it's not just about destroying God's enemies, because this Keystone of the Anointings highlights a special remnant of Israel. We're informed in these observations about key features of the Shemitah counted off from 1991. And we'll add this account to our collection as the 31st. In the second chapter of 2 Kings, we find another account involving Elijah and a Keystone pattern journey. In the action of the story, Elijah and Elisha travel together from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho, a journey in which three towns are identified. Then they go to a river, the Jordan. 4 destinations, with 3 of like kind on the way to finally arrive at the 4th, where the purpose manifests with some complexity to the drama. This example is now the 32nd in our tally. After reaching the Jordan, there's a miraculous crossing over, and the river plays as the river of time in this esoteric allegory. Elijah is taken up in a whirlwind, a whirling stargate that opened between heaven and earth. Elisha takes up the mantle Elijah leaves behind and returns back with it, crossing back over with a double portion of his anointing. Yes, he returns back where he had been, crossing the Jordan in the same way he'd crossed earlier. This seems to have something to reveal about the doubled Shemitah that pivots on the reset of time. In what's believed to be the earliest written book of the Bible, we find more Keystone patterns. Job was a blessed man who was severely tested as a result of a deal that Satan struck with the Most High God, in whom Job steadfastly trusted. Satan was allowed to touch Job's life. In the first chapter of Job, 4 of his servants come to Job in sequence, each giving the report of being the only survivor of a disastrous tragedy. In the first 3, Job loses both animals and servants. In the 4th, instead of animals and servants, Job's own children are killed, all 7 sons and 3 daughters. With this observation, we raise the tally to 33. Following those disasters, others come to Job and engage him in conversation. The first 3 are Job's friends, who are in agreement that his troubles are due to some hidden sin, which Job resolutely denies. In Job chapter 32, we read about the 4th and final man, Elihu, who engages with Job differently. As that engagement begins, the matter of timing and relative age is given plenty of emphasis, cluing us in to the esoteric subject. According to the familiar pattern, the first 3 are required as a prerequisite for the 4th, but the series required for the final result is not yet complete. In the 38th chapter of Job, after Elihu's turn, God himself shows up, and the end result is that what Job had lost is restored to him double, essentially. We'll account this as number 34 in our collection. Several more examples appear in the book of Daniel. In chapter 2, we read about King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a large metallic statue. The king's own kingdom of Babylon was represented by the head of gold. According to the interpretation given by God to Daniel, verse 39 reads, "After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another 3rd kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth." The chest and arms of silver are identified by historians as Medo-Persia. The middle and thighs of bronze are Greece. The legs of iron, with its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, is the fourth in sequence, Rome, and this is different from the others in structure and character. It's at the end of this sequence of four kingdoms that the rock cut out of a mountain without hands strikes this statue, which then fills the earth in a prophecy about the rock, who is Yeshua HaMashiach, and his kingdom. With this, our tally rises to 35. Before Daniel begins to tell the king about his dream and interpretation, he says in verse 28, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." It's been commonly understood that the latter days part involves the statue's feet and the rock that strikes them. However, because of the familiar pattern, we understand Nebuchadnezzar's entire dream and visions as revelation about these last days, informing us about what will be, even when it will be. Our next example comes from the next chapter, Daniel 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold and commanded all people in his vast kingdom to worship. 3 men refused, Jews. The king tried to execute them immediately by having them bound and cast into a furnace that was heated 7 times hotter than usual, but things went sideways for the king. Daniel 3, verses 24 and 25. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." 3 Jews who would not worship the king of Babylon's idol are miraculously saved and joined by a 4th figure, the King of the Jews and King of Kings, the only begotten Son of the Most High God. We'll count this as our 36th example. There are certain features that beg our attention here. When the prophetic import of this passage was revealed to me by the Spirit of the living God in March of 2018, it was identified with Shemitah 8:6:1 by the usage of the Hebrew word interpreted furnace, which is Strong's H861. This word occurs 10 times, and every time it's in this 3rd chapter of Daniel. That means something, and in the context in which this was highlighted to me, it serves to function as a validating lock on the calendar. Because of the significance of that feature, and because this tally isn't only about the formulaic keystone, we're bumping up the sum to 37. You can score it however you please. It's not the number attained in our generally rather conservative accounting that's important, so much as the sense of the scope conveyed in the presentation of this substantial body of evidence, which manifests a stunning level of agreement across the range of it. 2 more examples of the keystone design appear in the 7th chapter of Daniel, which are nested together here as a fractal. Daniel himself has a dream and vision. Daniel sees 4 great beasts in sequence, and the interpretation and context is similar to what was noted about the metallic statue of chapter 2. Nested within the description of the 4th beast and kingdom, another keystone appears. All this is presented in 2 verses of Scripture. Daniel 7, verse 7. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. The doubling of the 7s in that verse reference seems worth noting. From what's written in verses 19 and 23, we know this 4th beast and kingdom is being emphasized as different from the 3 that came before. The short version of the interpretation is given in verses 17 and 18. These great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. What an awesome result! We count this revelation about the sequence of 4 beast kingdoms as the 38th in our tally. And this is another one of the many that resonates with our understanding of the riddles of Proverbs 30. Recall how the first line of the 5 sets there begins with the expression that there are 3 things that will not be satisfied, 4 that will not say enough. And we rejoice to know that what will finally be enough is near. Now, another instance of the keystone is nested inside the 4th beast kingdom. Verses 8, 20, and 24 describe a little horn that comes up among the 10 of the 4th beast, a boastful king of particular note. This little horn uproots 3 of the first horns, a king who subdues 3 of the kings that had come up previously. In this we have yet another keystone design nested in a fractal relationship, and we'll count this example with the little horn as the 39th in our tally. It bears repeating that there really is so much more to these examples that we're skipping ever so lightly over. A very succinct example appears in the 10th chapter of Daniel. Verses 2 and 3, "In those days I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed." The completion of a season of not 1 and not 2, but 3 weeks of mourning is called to our attention, and only then does what is gained manifest, as an angel appears to Daniel in a vision. Strength and understanding is given about the last days in the context of spiritual warfare. This is according to the Keystone formula, bringing our tally up to 40. Here are some examples that pertain to the temple. When the divided house of Israel had been sent into captivity, the temple known as Solomon's was destroyed. When a remnant returned from captivity about 60 years later, the temple was rebuilt. The construction bore the keystone design according to a royal decree. Beginning in verse 3 of the 6th chapter of Ezra, we read, "Concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury." According to Young's literal translation, the great stones are rolled stones, which has something to say about time on the esoteric level, as does the fact that this was funded from the royal treasury. The notion of time as money is ancient, and money is time in metaphor. Do you know that this temple was the temple at the center of time even then? Even with the Ark of the Covenant being hidden, that location continues to manifest as the center of time. The design of the 3 layers of stones and 1 layer of timber speaks to us very particularly about time, even on the subject of the schedule of the end of this age. With this instance of the familiar formula, we raise the tally to 41. In the 2nd chapter of Haggai, the work of rebuilding the temple was encouraged. Haggai 2 verse 4 reads, "Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts." 3 times people are directed to be strong. Then, together, they're told to work, because the Lord of hosts is with them. And as the text continues, it resonates the extended keystone pattern in being told not to fear. And why? We add this to our collection as the 42nd. The book of Esther pivots around evil Haman's plans for the destruction of Mordecai and the Jews, and Esther the queen's role in turning around the fortunes of God's people. At the heart of the dramatic story, the full keystone pattern is evident. There are 3 days of fasting, followed by banqueting. The banquet that happens immediately after the fasting relates to the 4th Shemitah in the sequence, Shemitah 860. The fruit that will result from Esther's venture requires this banquet with the king and Haman as a prerequisite. the machinery is put in motion, as it were, and Esther requests another banquet on the next day. Only then is the hoped-for result secured, the salvation of the Jews and the destruction of Haman and the enemies of God. Esther's strategy that assured victory is a model of her God's strategy. In a genocidal war for survival, fortunes will be turned and great spoil will be gained for the victors. And this is playing out even now on the schedule of the Keystone design. With this example from the book of Esther, we'll bump our tally up to 43. Because the account of Esther as the king's bride presents the bride of Christ in an extended allegory, it's especially dear to us, like with the bridegroom-bride allegory in our 12th example, where Jacob labored 7 years to get Rachel as a bride, and then 7 more to finalize that result. In the 9th chapter of Judges, a story is told about the ambitious Israelite Abimelech and how he conspired with the men of Shechem to assassinate his competition. 70 men were slain, all brothers, but one remained to avenge them, Jotham. The Keystone pattern appears in the story Jotham told as part of what's called a curse in verse 57. It was prophetic. In Jotham's story, the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine are unwilling to forsake what they prize as their valuable offering to go wave over the trees. After the three of a kind, the fourth in sequence is willing, the bramble that represents Abimelech. Judges 9, 14, and 15. Then all the trees said to the bramble, "You come and reign over us." And the bramble said to the trees, "If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." The men of Shechem were not acting in good faith towards Abimelech, and the co-conspirators soon destroyed each other, just as it was pronounced by Jotham. His prophetic story was according to the Keystone formula, and in a further application we expect to see the destruction of those who conspire against the innocent as that curse plays out in the doubled Shemitah. We account this record of Abimelech and Jotham in the 9th chapter of Judges as our 44th example in the tally. Our next 4 examples involve a judge named Samson. At that time, Israel was being ruled over by the Philistines, and Samson was used by the Lord to cause disturbances in that relationship. Samson's strength and exploits are legendary. About his dramatic death, Judges 16:30 makes a suggestive observation. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might, so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he killed in his life. Just how many Philistines did Samson kill? That statement invites us to do the math, comparing the other occasions to the last one with our attention on the numbers. The obvious numbers are the counts of Philistines killed by Samson, but this inquiry necessarily leads us to discover how many occasions of killing there were. The first is recorded in Judges 14:19. Samson kills 30 Philistines in Ashkelon to pay his gambling loss after being betrayed by his Philistine bride. The second occasion was when Samson avenged the burning of his wife and her father the Timnite with fire. Judges 15:8. He struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Edom. We're only told that this was a great slaughter. No number is given, so we might take away from this that the numbers don't really matter then. If we weren't aware of the Keystone pattern, we might be content to think the statement made in Judges 16:30 was just adding some dramatic flair to the story. But we are aware, so we continue the study, and we find a third occasion. Judges 15 verse 15. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Until Samson pulled the house of Dagon down on himself to kill the Philistines present, there are no additional occasions of Samson killing Philistines. Because we're invited to do the math in this matter, we're led to discover the Keystone formula in the comparison of 3 occasions to the 4th of the same kind that is greater than the 3. With this, we raise the tally of examples to 45. There's more here that makes it very compelling as a time prophecy, but let's move on to the next one. A special pair of examples appear in connection with the first occasion of killing Philistines. Samson took a wife from the Philistines because God was seeking an occasion against them. He made a bet with 30 Philistines that they couldn't answer his riddle during a 7-day feast. In 3 days they couldn't solve it. On the 4th day, they threatened his Philistine bride, demanding that she entice her husband to reveal his secret so they could win the bet. Verse 17 tells us, "And on the 7th day he told her because she pressed him so hard." Samson was betrayed, and he avenged the conspiracy by slaying 30 other Philistines and seizing the spoil to pay off his bet. There are overlapping keystones here. For the first 3 days of the feast, the Philistines tried to solve the riddle themselves and failed. On the 4th day, they changed their tactic to one that succeeded. That's the 46 in our tally. Another keystone appears in that Samson's wife pressed him unsuccessfully for the solution for 3 days, days 4, 5, and 6 of the feast. Finally, on the 7th day of the feast, which is the 4th day of repressing, Samson finally revealed his secret, and this brings our tally to 47. And there's more here that's noteworthy, like with the featuring of the Shemitah resonant week of the feast. But let's move on. The last example in this collection that involves Samson appears in connection with the final occasion of killing Philistines. Samson was there as a prisoner in the temple of Dagon because he had been betrayed by a woman he loved named Delilah and broken his Nazirite vow. In the record of Judges 16, the lords of the Philistines bribed Delilah to entice Samson to reveal the secret of his great strength. She asks him directly, and he lies to her. A trap is sprung with Philistines lying in wait. This happens 3 times, and each time Samson easily breaks free. But Delilah was relentless. Judges 16, 15 through 17. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times, and have not told me where your great strength is." It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart, and said to her, "A razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." 3 times Samson lied and escaped the snare. But the 4th time was different. He divulged his secret, and Delilah had the 7 locks of his head shaved off while he slept, causing Samson's Nazirite vow to be broken. Judges 16, 20 to 21. She said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. From prison, Samson was taken by the Philistines to the house of Dagon, where he performed his last feat and died. 3 rounds of Samson's keeping his secret and staying free was followed by a 4th round, where he divulged his secret and was taken captive. This brings our tally of examples up to 48, and once more sets of 7 factor in. Let's return to the New Testament for a few more examples. In 2 of the Gospels, we find accounts of the feeding of the 4,000, a miraculous sign that took place on the shore of Galilee. Matthew 15, verses 32 through 38. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days, and have nothing to eat. and I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, Where are we going to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. The crowd had been with Jesus for 3 days. They were famished. Then they were fed, miraculously. Problem solved. Keystone. This is the 49th in our tally. What does it mean that 7 loaves went out in the distribution and that the broken pieces left over were collected into 7 full baskets? What does it mean that the nice round number of 4,000 were fed? Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 16 that there's an esoteric meaning in this and in the similar feeding of the 5,000 that's expected to be understood. Until we came to learn about the reset of time and the doubled four Shemitah, this was a mystery. Now we think not so much. In the 13th chapter of John, we find 2 more examples. These are additional to the one in verse 38, which was accounted as our first example. Jesus answered, Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you've denied me 3 times. As the final verse in the chapter, that 38th verse marks the end of the account of the Last Supper. Before the meal, some ritual takes place, and more keystone patterns appear. The very significant and prophetic Last Supper is bracketed with keystone designs. John 13, verses 3 through 5. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. In verses 4 and 5, we note that after rising from supper, Jesus, 1, lays aside his outer garments, 2, takes a towel and ties it around his waist, 3, pours water into a basin. On the basis of having finished these 3 steps, or 4 if you want to count his rising from the table, Jesus begins to do what required that preparation, washing the disciples' feet. This is a familiar pattern, yes? It's the 50th in our collection. Note that this was prefaced in verse 3 by a very distinctive returning back. We're told that Jesus had come from God and was going back to God. Why tell us that then? Take a lesson as you reflect on the similar elements in many of our examples. Let's continue the account with verses 6 and 7. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. There is an esoteric meaning, a prophetic meaning, and while it has not yet been completely fulfilled, as the appointed time nears, some of us are beginning to understand more about what he was doing, demonstrating in this ritual that's been recorded for our benefit, a prophecy about the schedule of his preparing a bride for himself, with the washing of water of the Word, according to Ephesians 5. In verses 25 to 27 of Ephesians 5, I read, Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the Word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Now, the very significant foot washing ritual is bracketed by activity of the keystone design. John 13, verse 12, When he had washed their feet, and put on his outer garments, and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you?" He, 1, washed their feet, and 2, put on his outer garments, and 3, resumed his place. With those 3 things done, Jesus can then proceed to address his disciples. He asks if they understand what he had done to them, and teaches them about how his example must be followed for them to be blessed. This speaks loudly to us, and with this example we raise the tally to 51. In this very special prophetic passage, we note that there are 12 disciples together with their Lord as the 13th. We note that it's in the 12th and time-numbered verse that they have been made one together, according to the point made in verse 8, that without washing they had no part or share with him. Then, in the 13th verse of the numbering of the mastery of time, the Lord identifies himself in relation to the 12. Verse 13, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." Yeshua is their teacher and Lord, and ours, and he is the Lord of time. He's the concealer and revealer of secrets, opening our eyes to see these encoded time prophecies that reveal the pattern of his schedule.